Chapter 20. The Town. Welcome to Colton. Sky's heart started a slow thump as she eyed the decorative sign. She pulled in a quick breath of air as she turned down the street and took in the surreal scene around her. A month ago these sidewalks bustled with people heading off to work or the store, children riding their bikes or coming home from school. Now they were empty except for bits of garbage chased by the wind. Most of the once cherished homes stood vacant. Many with doors and windows open to the outdoors, curtains billowing in and out of the casements. Sky scanned the area, searching for some sign of life, but she was hard-pressed to find any. Were Tom and Tricia the only ones left living here? The front door of the dollar store lay smashed, the shelves bare except for a few scattered, torn items. Bits of glass and wood from the broken door littered the entryway. They reflected the early morning sun rays and threw the light in rainbows across her windshield. The breeze pushed at an empty garbage bin, rolling it in front of Sky's car. She quickly pressed the brakes, then tracked the bin as it slowed near the back wheel of a deserted tricycle sitting on the street. It hit the little bike a couple of times and stopped. Sky stared at the trash bin for a moment, her heart heavy. This was like a scene out of a movie. And even though it surrounded her, she had trouble grasping the reality of what she saw. Her beautiful little village was now a ghost town. Had all towns suffered this kind of loss, and if they had, what were the cities like? If cities and towns across the world had lost this many people, how many were left? Her hands turned clammy. How would they live like this? Dylan had warned her, told her life would be different now. But snuggled up in that welcoming little cabin for the past few days, she had been entirely oblivious to the changes going on in the cold world around her. But now, seeing it almost took her breath away, and not in a good way. How would any of them survive? Jesse's fingers gripped the windowsill of the car as he stared wide-eyed at the surrounding scene. Looks like everyone keeps house the way Dad does now. Sky ran her hand through his hair and let a finger caress the side of his face as she said, "It will be okay, buddy." Jesse raised an eyebrow at her. Neither of them believed that. Sky looked him over. The boy was less shaken by the scene than she was, but he'd seen this kind of mess his whole life. It was normal to him. What wasn't natural was that the entire town was that way. Jesse set his chin on the windowsill. It's kinda spooky with no one being out there and all. Well, at least that means no sick or infected either. We should check out your house. Sky winced. It had been on her mind to do that, but she almost hated to see what had become of it. Okay. She swung a left at the next intersection and made her way to her little lane. There was a clear division between the first 3 houses on the street and the rest. The first houses were burned to the ground. Her house was the 4th, and it was fine. When her eyes landed on her large, country home, she blew out a sigh of relief. Why, she didn't know, it wasn't like she would live here anytime soon again. But even so, it was nice to see the wide porch with her red-cushioned furniture almost untouched. Garbage had made its way into her yard and driveway, but her windows and doors remained shut tight. This must have been where Tom and his deputies caught up with the infected and pushed them out. Sky looked at Jessie, a smile on her face. I wish we had time to go inside, but we don't, and perhaps we should wait for Wade and Dylan to do that, anyway. Sky bit her lip. Should she check on Tom and Tricia while she was in town? As of a few days ago, they were still here. But seeing Colton like this strengthened her resolve to go to her dad. Tom would, no doubt, give her yet another lecture on her unwise decisions. No, better to visit them on the way back. Then Dad, and maybe Charlotte and the others would get to visit too. Perhaps a text. But when she checked for a signal, there was none. If anything was still operating, she would be getting a signal here. Guess phones are just about worthless now. A little niggle of uneasiness went through her. She stared at her phone, trying to remember when she hadn't relied on it for something. Anna Lynn said it would be old school from here on out. I guess this is the first step. Sky still couldn't stop herself from tucking it back in her pocket. Old habits died hard. On the main road through town, Sky spotted movement up ahead. She drove closer and saw her neighbor, sweet old Mrs. McCleary. Memories came flooding back. Mrs. McCleary making sure Sky was settled in her house okay and bringing over baked goods warm from the oven. What was the elderly lady doing out here by herself? Sky gasped when she took in the woman's condition. Confusion covered the old woman's face as she turned this way and that as if trying to get her bearings. She held one arm stiff by her side, and the other flailed around seemingly without direction. Her mid-length white hair tumbled in a dirty snarl over her shoulders. Her usual pristine clothing full of holes and soiled with dirt streaks. Oh no. Sky slowed and pulled up beside the woman. There was no recognition in Mrs. McCleary's eyes as she shied away from the vehicle. Once the sick were at this stage, sudden noises disturbed them. Sky was close to the road leading to emergency services. She did an abrupt U-turn and pointed the car in that direction, praying she could find some aid. On arriving, Sky and Jessie saw only an empty building with a large note on the front of the door telling everyone to go to Fenton for help. Just as I suspected. Fat chance of that happening. Fenton is in ruins. Sky glanced at the office again and wondered if Dr. Kinder and his family made it out of Fenton. She ran a hand through her hair. Sky didn't want to leave Mrs. McCleary by herself in her condition, but what else could she do? She turned and drove slowly out of town. A town that took her in, a town where everyone helped everyone else. It pained her she was leaving someone in need. It could have just as likely been Sky wandering around on that road. It almost had been her. Her mind flashed back to the day she and Dylan were scavenging. He'd told her he helped the sick by giving them water and food. He left it in their path with the hope they knew what to do with it. Sky hit the brakes. She asked Jessie to get 2 bottles of water while she leaned over the seat and dug around in her stash for a couple of protein bars. What are we doing? Jessie grabbed the water and looked from them to her. What we can. Sky found the bars and turned back in her seat. It's not much, but we are doing what we can. She swung the car back the way she came and stopped a few yards from Mrs. McCleary. Sky jumped out of the Jeep and ran closer to the woman. Behind her, Jessie said, I don't think this is a good idea. Sky called out to Mrs. McCleary. The woman stilled but didn't turn to look at Sky. Mrs. McCleary? Sky held out the supplies to her, hoping she would understand. I will leave you some water and protein bars. I know it's not much. If you need more, there's some in my house. Just break a window and take it. The old woman slowly turned toward Sky. Mrs. McCleary? Do you see the food? She took a couple more small steps to her. The rise and fall of the woman's chest became more pronounced. A long, gargled wail started. Low in pitch, at first, but rising until the screech bounced off the hills around them. The flailing arm began to go up and down. Up and down. Up and down. The shriek continued to rise. Sky winced and covered her ears. Sky stood frozen as Mrs. McCleary turned inch by torturous inch until she faced Sky. Her face red with fury, she took a deep breath and returned to her wail. Sky hurried to set the supplies on the road. She calmly spoke to the woman as she did so. The screech continued. The arm chopped. Sky shivered. The eerie sound coming from the woman seemed unreal. She moved backward toward the car, sure there was plenty of time, but she wasn't quick enough. While the old woman had a bad arm, she still retained 2 good legs. Legs that had always been quicker than the average woman her age, and she used them now. Arm raised, wild, white hair flying, she barreled toward Sky. Taken unawares, Sky watched the woman come, her breath caught in her throat. Mrs. McCleary took off at a run and made it halfway to Sky before Sky gathered her senses enough to move. In a flash, Sky turned but slid on the pavement, going down on all fours. She huffed out a breath and ignored her scuffed hands as she heard what was behind her. Mrs. McCleary's snarled, angry breathing was loud and getting louder every second. Ahead of Sky was the car and Jessie frantically screaming, "Sky!" Desperate, she scrabbled and righted herself. Her feet took hold just as she felt Mrs. McCleary's gnarled fingers stroke her back. A scream built up inside her when the woman's hot breath fanned across her ear. Jessie flung open the driver's door, still shouting at her over and over, "Sky! Mom!" Sky dug deep and sprinted to the car, swinging around the open vehicle door. She came face to face with a frantic, furious Mrs. McCleary. Only the door was between them, and the window was down. The sick woman's good arm reached out to Sky, grabbing at anything she could and capturing a fistful of shirt and hair. For one moment, Sky thought sorrow flooded her neighbor's eyes. "I'm sorry," Sky said as she brought the car door back as far as she was able, then flung her weight against it, pushing the door toward Mrs. McCleary. The door forced the old woman off Sky, taking part of Sky's shirt and a chunk of hair with her. Jessie reached across the seat and pulled at her arm. "Come on, Mom." Sky jumped into the Jeep and slammed the door shut with one motion. She flung the still-running car into reverse and tore away from the wild, sick woman. Hands shaking, she positioned the car in the right direction and screeched out of the town. When she looked in the rearview mirror, Mrs. McCleary was already on her feet and chasing the vehicle. Sky bit her lip and sped away. A few miles out of town, Sky stopped the car. Her body shook, and she needed to get it under control. She laid her head on the steering wheel. Jessie patted her shoulder. "That's why you're supposed to stay in the car, Mom." Sky raised her head and looked at him. She smiled, then broke into laughter, and Jessie joined in. She reached out, gathering him to her. His body trembled as badly as hers. He patted her back again and said, "It'll stop in a bit." This child of trauma repeated the advice Dylan had given her. How sad this young boy knew that already. She nodded her head, then laid it on top of his. "So Mom, eh?" "Yeah," he replied softly. "Yeah." In the midst all the wrong of this world, this felt right.